Catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Hi, good evening, viewers and listeners, whether you're listening live or playing back. You're here with myself, Louise Pickering, and joining us this evening to talk all things revision is Mel Tynegate. Hi, Mel.
Hello, lovely to
How are
be
you doing?
here.
I'm so excited to have you on. As I said, the focus of today's show is we're talking about all things revision. So we're digging into kind of the research, the evidence, the neuroscience, a little bit of neuroscience, but also we're looking at classroom strategies. It's getting to that time, isn't it, Mel, when we all start to think,
Absolutely. Loads of mock exams have just happened, or students getting their papers back. Yeah, and start going, where do we go now? How do we change it getting up to Easter?
So I'm so thank you for coming on. I'm so happy to see you. Just so viewers kind of know how I know Mel. We actually worked together a few years back at a school in Milton Keynes. Was it like 7 years ago, something like that?
A while ago, yeah.
But it's so lovely to see you. And so many things have happened since obviously we last worked together. If you'd like to kind of introduce yourself a bit to viewers and tell us what it is that you're currently doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been in education for the last 16 years. The last 7 years have been in leadership. I've worked in a whole variety of schools. I think the school we worked at was a huge school with 1,800 students. I worked prior to that in a grammar school and was there for quite a number of years. I then, from there as well, I've moved on and worked in a school that had 40% pupil premium, which brings with it its own barriers and different things. And then typically within my leadership roles, I've been the person that's led on data and assessment, which is in some way how it's led me into revision and all things in terms of how students can do really well with that. I've also been the person that's been the timetabler as well, which is a slightly thankless job. But I do quite like the Tetris puzzle element of putting it all together and fitting it in. So that's I've kind of been in a variety of schools. I think as well, like the size of that massive school we're in Milton Keynes, and then my most recent school was a really small independent school that only had 105 students. I've kind of been in a broad range of different places, different schools, from state schools, grammar schools, independent schools as well.
It's such a wide kind of experience. My gosh, like 105, did you say 105 students?
Yeah, really small. There was 2 boarding houses as well, but really small school.
But it's amazing, isn't it, when you go to different schools? Now I've worked in 5 different schools, and every time I'm going to a different one, I think my smallest school was about started at 450, and then it ended up being about 600. And I thought, gosh, that's small. And you do really notice the difference, the job role that you're doing, even it could be the same role in a different school, completely different experience.
Absolutely, yeah, completely different. Yeah. Like the systems all slightly set up differently, aren't they? And it's kind of,
well, sometimes they're not.
That as well. Yeah. It can be really varied. I think particularly in the smaller school, you've definitely got much more one-person departments, and we had like a curriculum manager instead of heads of department. But very different to then when you're in a bigger school and you've got teams of 6 or 8 people in a curriculum area as well. Yeah, very different.
Right, well, fab. Well, obviously, the purpose of today is to talk about all things revision. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is probably, I think a lot of us think we know the answer, but I think because this is your area of specialism, you've had time to dig into this a little bit deeper than maybe, for example, I have. When we're talking about revision, if we kind of roll this right back, we know it's important. Students know it's important, even if we didn't know the research behind it, which we'll get to later. What is it that stops students actually doing it? What are the main barriers?
I think there's a couple of things. I think there's definitely like a struggle to start. And I know we'll all help them of going, make your timetable, put in your Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, put in your weekend, put in your subject. But I still think with that, there's a struggle to actually start and to know what they need to do. They might have written in, right, I'm going to do maths and I'm going to do English and I'm going to do geography here and history. But there's also that bit of, well, what do I do with revision? What am I actually doing when I'm revising my maths compared to when I'm revising my history? And so that struggle to start in the first place of knowing, rather than sitting there and spending 5-10 minutes of that time going, where do I get my resources from? And where do I find this piece? And what am I actually doing? Am I doing flashcards in this? Am I creating a mind map? And I think there can be that real struggle to start if they're not yet in that rhythm and that habit and have made it into part of their routine. So I think there's a bit there. I think also in terms of there's like the barrier, isn't there, to revision, and it doesn't sound nice and no one's like really excited to start their revision. And I think with that, students can fall into the trap of making revision quite nice and making it that they're studying the stuff that they already know a bit because they don't want to tackle the hard stuff. And with that, there's some bits with, well, where do they get the materials? If they didn't really understand that in class, just going back over their notes isn't going to necessarily help them with really understanding that to be able to answer questions. So I think there's that level of them struggling with where to start and actually tackling the difficult things as well.
That's interesting because you do have that. I'm struggling to find my words this evening because I'm so tired. You do have that. I remember as a student, I imagine you do too, where you sit down, and particularly A-level, I remember starting my revision in January thinking, okay, I do need to put a timetable together and I do want to start. I am keen to start. But then you do think, oh, if I start with the easy stuff, maybe it'll ease me in. But then you also think, if I don't start the hard stuff, is this actually effective? So what is your advice there?
So when I'm working with students, I very much get them to take a list of their topics. Quite a lot of schools do have, I think typically they're called personalised learning checklists.
Those schools. Babies.
Yeah, but taking one of those and actually going, right, which are the ones that I am confident in and which are the ones that I aren't confident in. Also using it as a working document of, right, I am now confident in that area, so they can start to see the progress and turn more things green as they're going through. But I do think there's quite a value in that, and I'm actually going through and going, right, can I actually do this? Can I talk about that confidently? Did I understand that? Yes, we've covered it. Do I understand it? And am I confident in answering questions based on that as well?
Yeah, very interesting. When we're talking about timetabling, is there a particular document that you use that kind of helps students? Because I remember thinking as a student, how many hours do I spend on every subject? Like, what's a decent amount of hours per subject? Should I be spending 8 hours on art a week? When should I be timetabling it in? Do you have a particular kind of go-to document that maybe viewers could potentially use?
Yeah, so I just found it online. It's got a bit of, it links, I believe it links a bit into James Clear's habits. So it's essentially got all written out in terms of, you do put in your subject, but then alongside that, you put exactly how long you're going to study it. So it might be that you're blocking out an hour. And I typically say to block out an hour, although not a solid hour of just sitting there revising and doing the same task. I do advocate for breaking it down into 20 to 30 minutes of doing one task and then moving into another task with that subject area to help in terms of your mental cognitive load, but also in terms of your working memory and being able to store that information. But within that as well, so it ends up being quite a long section that they list off their subject, the amount of time they're going to study, break down what topic it is that they're going to study in that subject. And so that needs updating a bit as they go through those. What it is they're going to do. So are they going to start off with a group of flashcards and then they're going to move into some practice testing? Where are they getting that information from? So have they got an online resource that they use, an online textbook? Are they going out to, there's many online items. Have they got a physical textbook that they're using? Are they using their own revision notes? Are they using their notes from class? So they've already got written out exactly where those bits of information are. I also get them to detail where they're going to do it, because that can be different places within their home. Are they going to sit at the dining room table where there's other people around? Have they got a desk in their room that they're using? Where exactly are they studying for that particular subject at that particular time? And then we do block it out in terms of times in the evening as well.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's quite a detailed thing, but I think that takes away some of the, well, what do I do now? I've said I'm going to study this. Where do I go? I feel it takes away some of that and gives them, right, I've got to do this, that, here. I'm doing it at this time. It's in this place. And so it's all mapped out for them.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. And I also think that students struggle to actually put that timetable together. And I think, I mean, anyone comments from viewers and things, by all means, please let us know what your schools do and how you support students in kind of doing that timetabling process. We tend to kind of build it into PSHE curricula and actually have sixth form tutors or, you know, year 11 tutors kind of sitting down one-to-one with students and saying, okay, this is how we do it. So it's interesting to kind of listen to how you do it and any particular documents that you have. And maybe at the end of the show, if you're okay, we can pop some of those documents up in case viewers want to kind of have a look at them and see what we can, you might even get some good amendments from people saying, look, here's mine, because that would be great.
Yeah, definitely. All up for
sharing.
sharing.
Okay, so that leads into the next thing. Is there anything that you think students tend to kind of automatically start doing when it comes to revision that you think is particularly ineffective?
Yeah, I think there's always the classic of, I'm just going to reread over this. I'm just going to highlight it. I'm just going to have a whole page of highlighting and I'm just going to reread over it. And I think we've all seen that, haven't we? Of, I looked over it. I looked over my notes. Yeah, I reread it. But they're not actively doing anything with it. And I've also seen some students that, there's the classic highlighting everything. Or you quiz them on, well, why have you highlighted that bit? I had a highlighter and I needed to use it instead of really thinking out what bit they were highlighting, why they were highlighting it, and going through that. So I think that's
it's like a full-on sentence. You're like, you've done the whole sentence though, and you kind of, when you get students that usually kind of like the younger years, they just don't know what effective highlighting or annotations look like, and you're kind of, okay, I've given you a revision guide. Let's work with this lesson. I'll show you how to use the contents, the index, how to navigate it, how to scan. And you're like, okay, dig out your highlighters, kids. We're now going to start highlighting. And then you walk around the classroom, and there's one student that's done the whole page. And you're like, you've just coloured it in. Like, what were you thinking? Nothing here is standing out. You're looking at a migraine from looking at that. Like, but the mind boggles.
Yeah. So definitely that. I'd also say probably one of the other things is them cramming, of them going, right, I've left it till the last minute. I'm going to stay up all night and it's suddenly all going to go in because I've spent 6-8 hours sat here studying this. And that isn't going to help them, just in terms of being able to go in, but also their lack of sleep as well. They really need the sleep because that is huge in our memory. And maybe we'll touch more on this later on, but huge in our memory of us being able to process it, take it in, and they absolutely need their sleep. So kind of pulling that all-nighter and cramming it in to go, it'll be fine then for the assessment. That's probably one of the worst things for them to do as well.
And that's actually one of my biggest frustrations. I teach GCSE and A-level and social sciences, but actually when I get students coming in A-level, particularly if I haven't taught them at GCSE, and they're like, it kind of gets time to revision for their first assessment, and you say to them, okay, so revision, what are you going to do? And they're like, well, I'm just going to reread and highlight. And then you say kind of, oh, how much did you then get the assessment results back? And you're like, you're a little bit away from your target grade. Talk to me. What did you do? And how long did you spend? And they're like, well, 30 minutes. And you're like, right. What were you thinking? And they say to you, well, I did okay at GCSE. And you're like, oh, the amount of coasters. What is that? And I have to have that long conversation at the start of the year. You can coast at GCSE and still get all right grades. That is not a possibility at A-level. Like, I've only ever known one student, and he was doing the IB, and I think he got something like 142 out of 144, and he did practically no revision and crammed. It just isn't successful at A-level. There's just too much stuff.
No, and it's not going to help them going further on as well. So if they're wanting to go off into university or into an apprenticeship, it's not going to help them then with having that life skill of being able to study and revise effectively, because they are going to come across other things. They probably will be, well, hopefully some of them lifelong learners. I still am doing bits and pieces now and doing a master's, and it's having those skills to be able to do that and to be able to do it effectively, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I'm going to move into kind of the next segment, which is the bit that I'm probably selfishly most excited about. It's the cognitive neuroscience bit. So I kind of want us to dig into kind of like the research that you've done anything you think is kind of standing out that teachers need to know. So I think my question to you is, how does cognitive neuroscience essentially, what does it teach us? What's the most up-to-date stuff? What do we know about how the memory works, cognitive load? What do we need to know when we're thinking about planning our lessons?
I think there's probably quite a few bits and pieces here. So in terms of like our working memory, I find that quite fascinating that we can't hold everything in our working memory. There's been some updated stuff. So there were some things initially with George Miller and this idea that we could hold sort of 7 things plus or minus 2 in our working memory. That's now been updated to that it's only 3 to 5 items that we can actually hold in our working memory. So really thinking about that, of that you can't be sat there for hours and hours and just trying to load loads of things in. So it's thinking about breaking stuff down so you've got your key points of information, because then you're going to be able to hold those in your working memory, but also that you can only hold those 3 to 5, and you just can't hold more. So I think it's been really aware of that in terms of our brain and how we can hold that information. I think that's quite crucial to know. In terms of our memory as well, that it does, as we know, like it starts falling out, essentially, does that information. Our brain it's deleting stuff, it's distorting it, it's generalizing that information. So it doesn't stay at the point that it came in. We have to go back and revisit that information. So that's where we've got in terms of doing our practice tests, of that going back to that information is going to help in terms of us remembering it. It's probably like one of the most depressing things as a teacher. We'd love that we can teach them and then it just stays there and they remember it, but that really doesn't happen.
No.
So I think definitely in terms of making sure that we're going back to things, we've got that actually, like doing practice tests really helps students. And I know that's kind of, not everyone necessarily wants to hear that, because there's kind of a bit of a controversy of schools that just test. And I hear this from parents as well, going, oh, the school does too much testing. They seem to test them every other week. But there is some science behind in terms of actually doing practice tests. And then the students that did the practice test, they remembered 50% more than students who were just kind of re-going over their information. So actually doing the practice test held a lot of value to those students of being able to hold and remember the information, because they had to go through the process of actually trying to retrieve the information and recall it from where it was in their brain. And the more times that you're able to kind of do the in and out process of retrieving the information, the more times it's building up those synapses in your brain for that information to stay.
Well, I'm so excited you literally mentioned synaptic transmission, because it was literally like coming out my mouth. I love teaching synaptic. It's one of my favorite things to teach. But it is, when you're thinking about it, you're creating neural pathways all the time. Like the brain is plastic. Your brain can change. At any age. It's most plastic when you're younger. We know this. The research supports it. But you're quite right. Learning is literally creating and strengthening those neural pathways, and the ones that you don't utilize. So they essentially they're synaptically pruned. They're cut. They're pruned. I tend to tell my students, it's like pruning a rose bush. When things are dead and you're not using them, you just snip them off. And your brain is literally doing this to things it's learned. Those neural pathways, the less you use them, the weaker they become. The chances are they're going to get pruned out of the system.
Yep.
So it's really interesting you mentioned space retrieval.
I was just going to come back to that. So I was in a conversation at the weekend, bizarrely, where they were talking about actually that we're probably of the generation where we used to read maps. And there's been some research now that students who have just grown up on Google Maps, they can't read maps so well. And also that ability to be able to find their way around, they just, in terms of their brain, and they've studied it, it isn't in the same way that ours are. And I thought that's very interesting, isn't it? Because actually we were probably of the age where we'd all like done the little AA planner beforehand, and we had a little sheet of paper and you had to put it down and you had to pay attention to the road signs because you had to come up at this particular junction. And actually we've now got these generations who they don't have to do that. They just follow that when the sat nav says to turn off, and haven't got that built in where they're having to pay attention to those things, or even understanding junction 6 is here and junction 8 is at that point. Whereas we probably have that more in ground because we were using it and we had to use it. Yeah. And So that pathway is there in our brains. And I was like, that's a really fascinating thing, which directly links into this. Yeah.
No, it's interesting because I love, sorry, I'm getting really selfish here, viewers. I teach A-level psychology, and this is one of the things that we teach about in memory is the idea that I think it's Maguire did a London cabbies study years ago. Like, is this the one you're talking? Yeah, and the idea that long-term memory is deeply linked to the posterior hippocampus. And so people that have to study, these cab drivers have to study for years and memorize what thousands and thousands of streets and like routes. Literally blows my mind because I'm there, like you say, with like Google Maps. I'm like, where am I going? But actually, they have a really, really sophisticated and well-developed posterior hippocampus, and they've done the same with medical students. They've done studies with medical students because the amount of knowledge that they have to retain in long-term memory is extensive, as we know. And actually, it's really interesting when you're looking at the science behind that. When we're talking about like synaptic pruning and transmission and how we're strengthening those neural pathways, it is about developing a part of the brain, and it is about kind of that plasticity allowing long-term memory to thrive. The brain, it gets me so excited. I'm so sorry, Mel. I'm
no, it's great. It's also if they're not using it. So they've also studied with those cab drivers that if they're then not using it, so they stop becoming a cab driver, they're not using those pathways that they once had, their hippocampus starts shrinking again. So they have an enlarged hippocampus while they're being the taxi driver in London and using, so the test is called the knowledge as well, which I find quite interesting.
Yeah.
To do. But yeah, then they've also found that if they stop using it, that area starts shrinking again.
Yeah, no, I love this. Fascinating. Okay, so we've talked about kind of hippocampus, long-term memory, kind of strengthening neural pathways. Are there any other, you mentioned earlier talking about study habits. Are we kind of able to come back to that a little bit, and you're able to educate me a bit on what it is that you've read there?
In terms of
James Cleary, did you mention?
James Clear in terms of habits, so in terms of building it as a habit, so putting it into your normal way of working. So he talks very much about you having a cue, so a particular point that you're doing it. So I talk to my students about, is their cue that they come in from the door and they're going to do their revision then, or actually are they someone that they're going to get a snack and a drink, and then once that is finished, that is their cue to start? Or do they even need an alarm? Like for some of them, that's okay. You need an alarm that goes off. That's your cue to start. Thinking about then it doing your habit. And then he also talks about the reward as well. So actually, are you going to reward yourself that you're then going to watch your favorite show and you're only going to watch that if you've done your revision? It doesn't have to be that you're kind of having a huge reward each time, but just that reward from doing it and what is the activity that you're going to do afterwards. So I quite like using that and his embedding of habits into your practice.
That's really interesting. Sorry, I know I've just come back and I've kind of done full circle. I've done the cognitive neuroscience, and then my brain gets really excited and it's like, oh, there was something I've not read. I want to come back to that. Okay, can I ask you a little bit about retrieval practice? I think a lot of schools are quite rightly talking about it now. And I think the research from what I've done is a little bit unclear. I think a lot of schools are now building into do nows that you have to have spaced retrieval every single lesson. But then I've been into conferences that actually say spaced retrieval to be effective doesn't have to be a certain way. It shouldn't be uniform, and it doesn't have to be at the start of every single lesson. So I kind of wanted to get your thoughts. What kind of research have you read that you thought was particularly interesting on retrieval practice?
Definitely the kind of doing interleaving and like interleaving of the information. But yeah, equally, I haven't found anything that says it has to be in this particular way or it has to always be at the start. I think it's definitely thinking about your structuring of your curriculum and how you can keep coming back to those bits of information to test the students. There is effectiveness in where you're doing mixed questions. So I've also seen that I'm trying to think where my research is, but definitely doing mixed questions, because there's a part of the skill isn't just the knowledge that the students need, but also how they actually answer the question. And part of that is them being able to recognise what the question is. So particularly things like maths, part of the skill there is it's all great if you're doing a lesson on fractions and they've got it, but then they're needing to read the question and work out what to do with those fractions when it's timesing or dividing. And that's the bit that they can kind of trip up on, because there isn't a nice little title at the top of that question that says, this is the part that it falls under, and this is the technique that you need to use. So I've definitely seen a bit in terms of those mixed questions and how they're really helpful. But yeah, I haven't found anything that says it must be at this point or it must absolutely be at every lesson. However, there is evidence to support that the interleaving does definitely help and support in terms of them remembering it. But that'll be purely based on those neural pathways. I also read a thing that was talked about it like, it's like walking through a forest. If you walk through a forest once, you make a bit of a pathway. If you then leave it, like the overgrowth is going to take it back. If you walk over that pathway a number of times and you go on that same route 10 times, you're going to start making a path through that route. And I thought that was a really nice analogy for it. That, yeah. And that also links in terms of the cramming as well. If you suddenly walk up and down that pathway 10 times, that day you're going to make quite a route, but over time it's still going to get grown back over. And so that interleaving and going back over that same path a number of times, you're going to create that route through to remembering it. But yeah, in terms of the actual timings, I haven't necessarily got that.
No, I think it's interesting. Like, I think I need, if I'm honest, I think I need to read up a bit more in this area. But what you're saying, it makes sense. So if we, now's probably a really good time to remind us all that we have some very generous sponsors. Hachette Learning, publishers of PD books and resources. They support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. So please do hop onto our website, see if we've got some discount codes available. We do from time to time. So Teachers Talk Radio website. And yeah, see if you can get some decent quids off some books, because the books are decent, it must be said. Okay, right, so moving to the next bit. So we've had a look at why students, the barriers, why they're not revising. We've talked about setting up timetables. We've then looked briefly a bit about like brain plasticity and neural pathways, synaptic pruning, and some fun stuff about hippocampus. Woo! Let's take this, kind of move the show forward a bit, if that's okay with yourself, Mel. We'd like to look at school-wide practice. So let's take what we kind of briefly know about spaced interleaving retrieval practice, plasticity, strengthening that kind of core knowledge. What key strategies have you found are effective in different subjects? Because it's one of those bones of contention that we say, oh, revise. And you get students saying, well, I know how to revise in your subject, but I don't know how to revise in that subject. Is there anything across subjects, or does it have to be subject specific?
No, I think they can use the range of techniques across subjects. I think there are some things that lend themselves more to particular subjects rather than others. So I'll take, for instance, English literature and actually learning their quotations. I've found where I'm working with students, the use of like a flashcard to be quite effective in terms of them having the quotation on one side, but then on the other side, not just the character or where it comes from, but also then the themes that it links to. So then they can be planning ahead for actually the types of questions that are likely to come up and the further information around it. So I think things like that can be really helpful. Particularly, so maths, where we talked there about having the mixed questions, I think that's really helpful. So I know there's lots of different programs out there for maths, and people being able to set them quite regular work for maths as well. So I'm quite an advocate with maths of little and often. So not necessarily even leaving it 1 week, but sort of your 20 minutes, maybe every other day, that the students are able to go back to those questions, and then also to be mixed questions, that they're then using that skill of working out the technique that they need to do when answering those questions. I think those are quite helpful. In terms of, I've seen quite good success with science and history in terms of doing bits of dual coding, and that can be in a number of different ways. So I'm quite a big advocate of a mind map, particularly at those early stages when they're really trying to cement in their head the initial bits of information. So they're not yet at the retrieval stage and they're there trying to take in the information, but using a mind map with both words and images to remember the information. I've seen that work quite well, as I said, with science as well. So particularly with some of their key practicals that they need to do, particularly one that I've been using recently is the osmosis one, and having then that in visuals and words to help the students in terms of remembering those.
That's really interesting, actually. I'd like to come back to mind mapping, because I think it's one of those concepts, sorry, they're one of those activities that teachers throw around, and we think that mind mapping is brainstorming. And it's not, is it, Mel?
No, so there's a guy called Tony Buzan, and he made it. Sorry, I get really excited here.
No, I was literally just Googling because I used to deliver sessions on Busan, and I was like, who was the chap? And in the background, I've been trying to Google it. Tell us more about him, Mel.
So Tony Buzan, he made it his whole life's work about mind mapping, which I find fascinating. He then helped governments, like in Singapore and places, and worked with various businesses and became this sole expert in how you could, even within a business or within government, use mind maps to help you. So he's a really big advocate of mind maps. He talks about, and this is probably like, I don't feel I was ever trained on this. I kind of come about this on my own research. He talks about that the lines that you're making in your mind map, they should be organic, because that's how our synapses work in our head. We don't work on a nice, neat, straight line. He talks about that each pathway should then have a nice link into another. He was not a fan of you kind of doing this mad spider diagram of one thing linking from one side to the other, because he was like, no, that is not how our brains work. So we shouldn't do this on our mind mapping. He was a big advocate that you should have a picture in the middle of your mind map. And then from that, you should go out and have pictures going around. Not everything needs a picture, but where appropriate, a picture to help with encoding that information. And that you should use colours for your different sections. Those colours don't really matter too much, but it does just help in terms of your brain. So they don't have to be that you've got a particular yellow for a particular thing, but it just helps in terms of your brain of them being able to remember those items. Yeah, I find him quite fascinating that then he's turned mind mapping into his whole thing. He's then there's a whole like online mind maps website as well that he initially set up. Yeah, no,
thank you for mentioning that, because I will put that in when we put out the edited version of this. Obviously this will be on YouTube forever. No fear. In case you ever forgot, it's still going to be there forever. But I will obviously also put the link under my LinkedIn posts with snapshots of this show, so people know where to find that website. It's really helpful in showing you how to actually show students how to mind map effectively. I've led a couple of sessions on it in recent years at a couple of schools. And actually, you'd be surprised when you say mind map, students are like, yippee, a spider diagram. And you're like, oh God, no. It's so different. It's more conceptual. But actually... Yeah, sorry, did you want to say something?
Yeah, no, so it also is about using the keywords, and then the rest of the information is like behind it. It's like a trigger word for the rest of the information. You're not trying to fit all the information. You're not trying to write a whole paragraph onto this mind map, but instead you should be picking out the key word that then helps with triggering all that information behind it, which I think is why it works quite well, as I said, with like histories and sciences. In history, we know there's so much information the students need to know, but actually if they can pinpoint it down to those key words and think about key concepts of a particular thing, that can really help them.
Yeah. The alternatives, so we've obviously got brainstorms and spider diagrams, kind of the same thing. You've got your mind maps, which are your big chunky kind of things. Like you said, they're more visuals and they're coloured, and it kind of represents, I didn't know this, by the way, so thank you for letting me know, that actually represents brains and synapses, and it actually is like a visual representation of what our brain is doing. But we also have concept mapping, and I think we did this at our school, a few years ago. We were both at the same school in Milton Keynes, and actually, I think as one of our colleagues that I had on a previous show, Shami Rahman, showed me how to actually concept map, and that's particularly effective for so English, history, economics, social sciences, where you've actually got or RE, to be honest, probably most of the subjects, you've got these core themes running through, because at A level in particular, you've got fairly synoptic exam papers in some subjects. I don't know if they still do them in English literature. They did when I was doing them. Who knows now? By all means, viewers, please educate me and put in the comments and let me know. But actually, concept mapping is really good, because actually what you're doing is what Mel's talked about, is bending kind of like theories or ideas and being like, here's the link. It links to this era in history. It links to this era. You can see how economics has changed throughout this whole Tudor period. And then literally, the students have to physically think, and it's the thinking that really embeds things into long-term memory, into the hippocampus.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we've got different techniques there in case people wanted to try them. But yeah, thank you for mentioning the mind mapping website by Busan, because it really supported me when I was delivering sessions on that. And I think our students do need those sessions.
He's also got some great stuff on YouTube as well, if the listeners want to look out for that, where he talks through in terms of why they should be the organic lines, and talks through, in terms of the pictures and things like that. So some great stuff out there.
Can I ask you a little bit about dual coding? Because I've seen some things on LinkedIn, and I've seen a couple of really interesting blogs. what is dual coding and what is it not? Because I feel like what I know about dual coding is really superficial, and I think it's quite controversial the way that it's being implemented in some classrooms.
Oh, I'm not going to profess to be an expert here. I have, but I think I possibly know where you're going with this. If I have seen it in some classrooms have been, we need a picture linked to everything to help us to remember it. I don't think it's on that. My understanding is it is pictures and words, but you don't need everything to be dual coded. Like, and Tony Buzan as well in his mind map isn't saying you need a picture next to every single item. It's just where it's helpful and appropriate to help in that memory. I don't think it needs to be in absolutely everything, but it is about you having the visual to help alongside it.
You know, I think it might be. I'm just thinking about to my early practice, like post PGCE years. I think I did this thing which I thought was dual coding, where I literally would stick a picture on something. And like you say, I have a word or a concept and I do a picture which I thought represented it, but it was a really superficial representation. So it didn't actually aid dual coding at all, because my brain just thought, oh, you know, we've talked about cognitive schemas, and therefore I've drawn up a schema of something and it looks really rubbish, and my brain hasn't actually really understood what a schema is from the visual representation. So I think by all means, please kind of send in research and let us know your thoughts. But dual coding needs to be something that isn't superficial. A student has to be able to look at a visual and be like, that's the actual concept. That's what it means at a deeper level, rather than just like, here's a flashy, fun little colourful picture to help you remember the word as it is. Just the word it actually needs to represent the concept itself. And I think I fell into that trap really early on. And I also did that thing when I was designing PowerPoint. So I was like, I find this funny. So here's a word. It sounds similar to this word. So I'm going to put a picture next to it, which represents the word that it sounds like. And so my students, I thought it was hilarious. My students were probably deeply confused, because they were like, why is Pickering got a picture of a filing cabinet for schemas? That's really got, it's a really, really tenuous link. And it probably confused them more than it did help their long-term memory.
I do also remember these things as well, of like pop picture and try and get them to associate with those pictures. And it's like, it shouldn't be this kind of matching thing of try and make some weird odd link that you can to try and remember it. I think it has to really help with being able to understand the wider things behind it as well.
Not just clip art, because I'm pretty sure I was just word arting and clip arting crap in, and I was like, oh look, this looks funny, this looks nice, this will make them laugh, pop here. But I was probably really hindering their ability to learn. And I think
so. I talk as well about it has to be what works for them. And the image that works with them. I'm also, there's a guy called Jim Quick, and he's really big in terms of memory and being able to visualize things. It's probably going off on a slightly different tangent.
Go for it.
But he talks about being able to remember like the first 10 items in the periodic table. Students don't need to know that for science. I'm very aware of that. They get given that information. But he talks about that you can go through a really visual account in your head of linking from the initial word to a new word that is quite similar to it, and then from that to make this elaborate story. So he starts off, I'm not a science teacher by trade, but I think that it starts off with like helium, and so you think of like a helium balloon, and then you've got lithium, so you think of batteries. But he's got this elaborate story where you've got the helium balloon taking you off into the sky, and then it's raining these batteries, and you can see these batteries, and then maybe the black and amber coloured ones, and then that pops the balloon, and then you go down to a water hydrant, because that's for hydrogen in the periodic table, and then from there that bursts, and then along comes an ox, and that's for oxygen, and then you have to clean the oxygen's teeth, and so that's for fluoride, that you're cleaning its teeth, and so you've got all of these parts happening in this really elaborate story, and at the end a neon sign goes off for neon. I realise I haven't done all 10 items there, because there's also a diamond that happens in it.
Impressive though, I'm not going to lie, this is impressive.
These are like me remembering all of these bits from this story, because essentially you take all of these items, and he's like, the madder the story, but the more visual you can make it, the better, because then you can go through and you can pick out those bits. I do this with some students in PE, of going, because they have to remember all the bones in the body, and we start off with a crane, and then the crane has got a scalpel for scapula, and then there's Elvis playing on the radio for pelvis, and we go through the parts of the body with these random parts and these random weird stories. But the whole point is that in the exam they'll sit there and go, that mad story, like I'm doing now, of going, right, I can remember there was this ox and we were cleaning the ox's teeth. And then you start going, these are the 10 items.
It's so funny. I had a conversation with my mum. My mum was a head of science many years ago. She's retired now, and she was saying it used to be her favourite thing. Obviously, you can't go in the exam hall, can you, when it's your subject being examined? But she used to sometimes peek through the hall, the doors, and she'd literally see the students, and you could see the cogs whirring, and you're talking about them thinking about this mad story. So in science, she would teach them about waves. So it'd start off like gamma, and you'd see and you literally would act it out through your body, radio waves and all the different colors of the spectrum, and infrared, and then you watch them being like gamma at the end in the hall, just acting out the length of the waves. That stuff's also quite useful, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Like if they can be able to picture it and visualize it, and use their body as well, that definitely works.
I was working with a consultant on Oracy recently, and he was linking back to you saying about English literature and GCSE, and like how many quotes they needed to learn for A Christmas Carol in particular. And he was saying originally when he kind of came in and took the class on, they just weren't retaining anything when it came to quotes. And particularly if you've got more of a dated or a classical piece of literature, it's written in a way that is slightly, not accessible to many of our students. And he was like, he got them literally just charading out. He's like, these chains you forged in life, and they're there, just act. And you can see again in the exam hall and the assessments, they're like, the chains we forged in life, and that's how they remember it, because they find it comical. It's not, they are repeating it, so it's the repetition of keeping those neural pathways going and kind of strengthening those, but it's also just the fun of being like, I remember doing this. And it's also linking into tolving. We teach tolving at A-level psychology, talking about how it's context dependent cues and state dependent cues, and how that kind of allows you to kind of recall older information from your long-term memory. And you can actually get in your body physically, state dependent cues, doing the things that you did when you were learning them, that actually helps you to retain the concepts and the kind of the quotes that you're trying to remember, essentially. Sorry, I'm getting really excited about this, Mel. I need to rein this in.
No, it's good. I've also done it can work a bit in terms of with studying for assessment, but I did quite a bit of research as well into like looking generally at memory and how they remember, for like when they have, it's quite an Americanized thing, but the memory challenges, and they can suddenly reel off their deck of cards, and that's all about them being able to place that information on a particular pathway and a route. So typically they'll remember like a walk or normally like a walk around, like from their house to like the local shop or something. And on each of the items as they're going along, they're placing those there. So it might be that they've literally got the front door, and then there's a plant pot, and then they've got to open the gate, and then there's a fence, and then there's a hedge. And on each of those, they're placing the 5 of hearts or the 3 of clubs. But they're like trying to link it into those items as they go along. So they've essentially got all of these paths, and then they're linking the objects there.
That's really interesting.
That's quite fascinating as well. Yeah,
it's really interesting to see how other people's brains work, and like, but we also have to remember, like you said, that actually what I have this habit as a teacher thinking, oh, this worked for me. I got good grades at A-level, this worked for me. It will work for everyone else. And you kind of panic, don't you? Like, okay, so for me, it was spider diagrams and it was concept mapping and then just loads of exam practice. And don't get me wrong, not knocking those techniques, definitely not the exam practice, that's essential. But you're quite right. Things like this, I've never, honestly, not thought about. I didn't know that you could, I don't know about you, but when I remember things, I do remember smells and sounds and where I was when I was doing the thing. So it is context dependent remembering and forgetting, solving. But actually, it's really interesting that you mentioned that students can literally do this out and either physically do it or in their head place things. I hadn't thought about doing that.
So in the same way, so they can do it within their home. So I also teach them about, you could have a particular room that's dedicated to a particular subject, or maybe a particular book in English literature, and where you've got your post-it notes or flashcards with that information and be placing them on objects around the room. So we talk about, well, you've got your computer and you've got your lamp and you've got your router and your blinds, and having each of those items then pinned around a particular room of that information. You can actually physically put the flashcard and post-it note there, obviously with their parents' permission. I always check with that as well.
Do you know what I did? I had this conversation, I think my GCSE and A-level students recently, and they were like, Miss, what did you do to revise? And I'm like, well, English literature was my biggest one, where I had I had to remember, I think it was Songs of Innocence and Experience by William Blake, and we weren't allowed to take texts in. So we had to remember, I think it was like 15 or 16 poems, and they were, I mean, there was one that was short, something about a worm flying in the sickness of the night or something like that. But the rest were really long. And not only did I have to know like all the rhetoric and all the literary devices, I actually needed to know the poems off by heart. And I said to them, like, have you ever done this thing, kids, where you literally just print things off and stick it around the house? And they were like, no. And I think they probably thought I was a little bit crazy, because I told them what I did was I printed all these poems in year 12 and I stuck them around the house, and I refused to let myself leave the room until I'd fully successfully recited it. I said, I even did it on the toilet. I know that sounds crazy, but I stuck one in the toilet. And so every time I went to the toilet, I sat down. I wouldn't, sounds a bit like control freakery, I wouldn't let myself get off the toilet until I'd actually successfully recited that poem. And so every time I went to the toilet, I was like, well, I'm going to be reciting that one from William Blake. And then I knew when I went to bed, there'd be one right by the side of my bed. And so I inbuilt the revision into my day. It wasn't just, here's an hour here, here's an hour here. It's I wake up, the first thing I do is I read this poem and I recite it, drink my cup of tea, I get dressed. But I think my students are probably a bit like, are you unhinged? And the answer is yes. I was unhinged. I still am.
But
it worked.
Science behind it, because you were then, when you were then in that exam hall as well, you'd be able to take yourself to that place in the kitchen of like, right, here's the one here. Yeah, right, I'm there in the kitchen. Right, I can see it. I can visualize it. I can retrieve that information. And so you're actually in your headspace being able to take yourself to that place where you've logged that information.
Yeah, and that's like another frustration I have. I say to particularly my higher prioritizing students who are pushing, for their A stars, A's, B's, or 7s to 9s, you haven't got time to think in the exam. You just don't have time to think. You have to know it so quick that the biggest concern you have is your handwriting speed. And I even had to have that conversation, I think, with some of my A-level students today. I was watching them doing assessment practice on schizophrenia for A-level psych, and I'm like, I know you're not thinking about it. It's your handwriting speed as well. So if your handwriting speed is a concern, which it is for a lot of students, they're just not quick enough. We haven't got time to actually think in the exam. You need to know it so quickly that you're literally like, yeah, this, plan. There's the occasional thought, for the occasional harder skill like evaluation or analysis, but it needs to be so deeply ingrained that you don't rely on thinking in the exam. Your planning time is not thinking. Your planning time tends to be regurgitating something you've already done 50 times over.
Yeah, the more times they've done it and they've rehearsed it, then it is just going to come out. The other thing as well with their brains, that if they're in flight or fight mode, if they're in a panic state going into that exam, they're just going to struggle to access that memory information. Your brain just can't then access it, because if you're stuck in flight or fight, you're really struggling to access your memory stores. So you need to get yourself in a calm state as quickly as possible. And that's where the students will go, I just went blank and I can't remember it, and I couldn't remember it, but I could come out and I could find all this information. And that's when you're in your flight or fight state that your brain physically can't access your memory stores. I also find that really fascinating of trying to teach students in terms of that calmness and being able to recognize they're not in that calm state yet, so they can get themselves back there as quickly as possible.
I tend to have that conversation with students, pretty similar to you, where I'm like, accept that this is happening. And they've got a fifth one. So it's now fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or flop. They've actually, the flop one. One of my students told me about this the other day, and I'm like, oh, this is new, because originally fight or flight was based on male participants. And when they were measuring cortisol levels, because they wouldn't use female participants like they don't in many clinical trials because of too many fluctuating hormones. And so we were teaching this totally patriarchal scientific theory. But yeah, that fifth stage of flop. But it's interesting. I now say to my students, you're probably going to have, my more anxious students, you're going to have that panic. Allow and know that panic is coming. Yep. Allow yourself the time. I literally say to mine, allot yourself time for the panic. So I'm like, okay, the panic has kicked in. Now it's time to look at the clock. I'm going to allow myself 1 whole minute to panic. And then I'm going to start thinking about it differently. And then I asked them to compartmentalize the panic. But again, it's a practice thing. So when I'm doing assessments with them, I'll often say, what I want you to do when you're practicing an assessment without me, I want you to start doing this strategy and this strategy. So you then build in time and strategies for the panic. I feel like I'm deviating.
The biggest thing is recognizing that they're in that panic state, because otherwise they can just spiral and carry on. And it's that first step of recognizing you're in the panic, you're panicking, recognize it, so then you can do something about it. Yeah.
Thanks, Mel. Sorry, I feel like I've taken us on a right tangent, but I've gotten really excited. One of the questions that I really wanted to ask you, that I know you know quite a lot about, is revision approaches. How do we make them inclusive? I have regularly fallen in recent years, and I think, we're talking about revision, we just kind of see a class and we're like, okay, what are the strategies? We've talked about the science and what are the strategies, but actually, how can we make those strategies more inclusive? Because I read a really lovely article the other day on LinkedIn by Tom Sherrington saying that actually, if we're not designing lessons that are inclusive, we're essentially saying that revision is important for this student, but this student isn't as important. And it is, excuse me, it's a social justice issue. So how can we design inclusive revision strategies into lessons?
I very much see it like when I'm teaching my students about revision, I very much teach it as like, here's your toolkit, so then they can access the items in the toolkit. So I teach it in terms of, so I have I've got a number of students with different SEND needs, and they're all individuals in terms of the way that they can work. In terms of what they can, what works for them and what is working with different subjects. So it's teaching them like the particular ones, as we've talked already, in terms of, I think mind maps work better with these ones, and I think flashcards work better with these ones, but giving them the whole spread of different techniques that they could be using, so then they can make some of their own decisions as to those techniques and which ones work best for them. I'm finding at the moment blurting is a bit of a marmite with students as well, that some are absolutely loving doing blurting and some are absolutely hating it. But part of what I'm teaching is there are all these different techniques that you can be using, and finding out which ones work best for you, using a variety, not just going, I like this one and I'm going to now use this to the nth degree with all of them. And I think in terms of that inclusivity, it's recognizing that actually that the spaced in points of coming back to the information, there might need to be more of those for some students, and that's okay. And putting in more of those like testing points for students, there might need to be more of those, so then they're getting used to the mixed tests and being able to access that part in terms of not just the knowledge, but also what they're doing with the question. And I think it's recognizing that, and that's okay, and kind of normalizing that it's okay, and it's okay to struggle. And actually, there should be that bit of struggle with learning. If it's not some difficulty, are you actually learning? Are you just at that easy point where you're going, I'm picking the nice thing and the thing that feels quite nice? And so I think it's sort of, normalizing that it's okay, and it's okay to struggle. But I think recognizing that the spacing is probably needing to be slightly more with some of our students.
Yeah, that's interesting, actually. When we're talking about, and that's something I've tried to do in my classroom more recently. All my students have all the past papers in a big fat wallet, as well as on Teams. And I'm talking about, coming back to things and revisiting old topics. In psychology, a lot of it is synoptic, even at GCSE. And I'm like, okay, you've got this wallet full of past papers, what are we going to do? And they dig them out, and I'm like, okay, so choose some things you'd like to do in today's lesson for your PP revision, for your exam tomorrow. And you can see them, oh, look, criminal psychology, my fave. I'm going to pick this. We did this recently and it's my fave. And I'm like, no, stop right there. And you actually have to model it with them. Okay, these are the papers. Tell me which particular question is hard. What do you feel uncomfortable looking at? And they usually pick out one that says something about the neuropsychology. And at GCSE, they're like, what does neuropsychology mean? And I'm like, God, I haven't taught it. I need to go back. But actually, you then have to model with them the discomfort. Look, here's one. Oh my, I often do this thing. I'm like, oh my God, here's one. And I kind of fake that I don't know what I'm doing. And I'm like, oh, it's a maths question, bit of faux maths anxiety in here. And I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. Oh my God, someone passed me a calculator. I've got it wrong. Hang on a second, show me what to do here. And some student usually, miss, you do this, you simplify this and you do this and you divide by this and you add it together and there you go, there's your mean. And I'm like, you legend, you absolute legend. And they were like, oh my God, I found it really difficult before. And well, you just taught me it. You targeted one that you found difficult and you've now taught me it. And then they're like, and you have to model the discomfort with them and you have to fake it a little bit, don't you? To be like, look, this is what learning looks like. It is uncomfortable. And if you waltz in my classroom and have an easy, breezy time and waltz out, I have failed you.
Yeah,
it
should be a bit difficult. It's been okay with that uncomfortability with it as well. And I think you were brilliantly saying that about because it is that scaffolding as well, like modeling modeling how to do things, scaffolding pieces down as well, and putting that into our practice. And I know loads of us are doing that in the classroom. And so it's just bearing that in mind as well in terms of our revision, that still using those scaffolding, those techniques. There's loads of great things in English about how setting up their paragraphs and how to answer for particular questions. And so still giving them those techniques when you're giving them a past paper of like the top bits to do on the particular questions, or pointing them in the direction of those to help them, not just suddenly go, we're now revising, off you go. It's still, helping them, modelling, scaffolding for those students as well.
Interesting. Now, I know we're really pushing time, so we've got like 3 or 4 minutes. But there's one question that I'm currently missing, and I want to make sure that we get to it. And I think this is really important. And I think quite a lot of my shows have talked about this before. We've talked about kind of the barriers. We've talked about quite a lot of the cognitive neuroscience and the theories behind long-term memory and kind of space interleaving, all that kind of jazz. We've then gone through quite a lot of specific classroom activities cross-subject that we can be doing. And we've just touched on inclusion. The next stage I think we need to talk about, last thing, is CPD. What advice would you give to schools about supporting staff with understanding kind of either the neuroscience or implementing strategies in the classroom? What should schools be doing? Should it be a one-off thing, or thoughts?
I think I've kind of found in my own experience it's largely been a one-off thing. I think I'd probably advocate for a whole school culture of this, of actually having everyone involved across the whole school. And I think as well, we tend to typically see revision as much more for our GCSE and A-level, as we've been talking about here. I think if we can start embedding it much more with our year 7s, because and I'm talking from a secondary perspective here, but we do test them as soon as they come in, and we are then giving them assessment points as they're going through, and we do start that from year 7. So I think if we can get in there earlier with highlighting the range of techniques they can be using, as well as that you've got to pick the hard stuff that you don't know yet and be using that, and that's where the difference is going to come, and that's where the greatest leaps are going to come from one grade to another grade, because ultimately that is what we're testing them on, and that's what we're looking at largely. I think it's definitely whole school, starting off with year 7 and involving everyone in it.
I think that's really important. I think actually that was something that our school, years ago did quite well, and I think it's still doing quite well. They have staff inserts, and I know many schools do this, of like carousels. And so you'll literally identify staff that are really effective with a particular revision strategy, and you'll literally dedicate, a couple of hours in your insert on and off. So people can literally be like, oh, okay, I want to hear about that revision strategy. So for example, I delivered one on mind mapping and how you actually did it according to mind mapping techniques with Busan, who you mentioned earlier, and actually there was one thing I did want to ask you. We talked about flashcards. And I know you mentioned about how it's good for quotations, particularly in English literature, and remembering those, and obviously linking to themes and kind of topics as well. There's a particular method that you're actually meant to use for flashcards. And I think actually it's probably one of the most important things we can say in this show, because flashcards get chucked around all the time, don't they? Like, what are you going to do tonight? I'm going to reread, I'm going to highlight, I'm going to create flashcards. Yeah. And what are you going to do with those flashcards, Bobby? And he's like, reread them, miss. What's the method that we're meant to be doing?
So my biggest thing, you don't just make your flashcards and then sit them there on your desk. They are to be used. They are an equipment piece that you should be using, handling, and using all the time. So we shouldn't just have them sat there. There's a technique called the Littner method, where essentially you go through, you test yourself. So flashcards are double-sided as well. I think most students have now got that. That used to be like one of my things of, it's not just a one-sided piece of paper or card, it's double-sided. So you've got the information on one side and then the key like header or quote on the other side. Use it to test yourself, use it to get someone else to test you. And then the ones that you're not getting right, they should be going in a pile that you're going to come back to. So where we're doing that interleaving, and that's the Littner method. You can have, the Littner method, I think technically teaches that you've kind of got these 5 blocks going along of like, I've got it, and then they move up the block each time. Or you can be doing as basic as, I've got it right and I've got it wrong, but it's important to come back to those ones that you haven't got right, because that's where you're going to build those pathways of that information. You're going to be walking that forest path, and you're going to be building that information, and you're going to then be able to, in your long-term memory, remember that.
I'm loving this sweet little forest path situation we've got going on. You mentioned this, and I'm like, I don't normally do visuals in my head because I've got aphantasia. Like, I really struggle with that. Like, you say to me, imagine an apple. My brain's like, it's a blank canvas in there. I can't do that. But actually, I'm really loving it because my senses are like, oh, look, we're walking a little warm path. This is what's happening inside my brain. There's some information, and I'm wearing it down. But thank you so much, Mel. There's been so much in this show. I feel like I've probably gotten really excited. But thank you, because you've taught me so much. So we've talked about the barriers, if people that are kind of playing it back and they're thinking about which parts of the show they want to come back to. We've talked about barriers at the start, why students struggle. We have talked about the cognitive neuroscience in the second part of the show, and you educated me quite a lot on that, which was nice. And I think we've been focusing for the large part mainly on strategies that you can be using in the classroom. So Mel, if people kind of want to reach out to you and find out more about revision strategies and on kind of what it is that you're doing and focusing on, and if you've got any resources they'd like to share with you and vice versa, where can people come to find you?
I'm on LinkedIn, so Melissa Tynegate on LinkedIn. That's where you can find me.
Fab. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Mel. It's been, as I said, selfishly, I've got quite a lot from this. I hope the viewers have too. As I said, reach out to Mel or out to me. I will be back again in 2 weeks, and I'll be here with Geraldine Tando from Northampton Academy, International Academy, talking about inclusive practice, something that I think is really, really important, and it has been for a long time, and it will be, hopefully, for forever. So thank you so much for taking time this evening, Mel, and viewers for tuning in. It's now time to go off and get dinner.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, it's been fab. But yeah, wonderful. Have a lovely evening, everyone. And yeah, we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.